Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are really opening the vault on something that's, well, it's not just big,
No, it's immense.
it's systemic, and it's happening right now. We're talking about the largest movement of private capital in recorded history, a phenomenon some people are calling the silver tsunami.
Or the silent avalanche, which I think is maybe even more accurate. It's truly a colossal movement. I mean, it transcends any prior wealth transfer event we've ever seen.
And this is wealth built up over decades, isn't it?
Yeah.
Primarily by the baby boomers and the silent generation.
That's right. And it's all poised to flow towards Gen X and the millennials. The sheer quantitative foundation is just staggering. But, the real story isn't in the number itself.
It's in the risks those numbers reveal.
Exactly. The structural risks.
Okay, so let's unpack this. When we talk about the size of this, what are we actually looking at?
We are looking at approximately $84 trillion globally,
84 trillion.
poised to change hands over the next quarter century. And look, this isn't just some market speculation. This is actuarial reality. It's demographics dictating these massive financial shifts.
Right. And our source material for this, and we've got a whole stack of strategic reports here on economics, asset management, societal impacts. It tells us this whole thing introduces a seismic level of complexity.
It really does. Our current financial systems, our legal systems, they're just barely equipped to handle the unique nature of this wealth.
Exactly. So our mission today is to give you the comprehensive shortcut. We want to move beyond just that big shiny number and analyze the core challenges. I mean, these are almost existential challenges.
Like what, specifically?
Well, how do you efficiently manage huge blocks of illiquid assets? Things like private businesses, inherited real estate, and maybe even more urgently, how do you stop digital fortunes, crypto tokenized assets, from being permanently lost?
The technological gap.
A huge one. And then fundamentally, what does this all mean for wealth inequality, for social mobility, and just for the basic behavior of our markets?
And we're going to dissect these complexities head on. Because understanding this deep dive, it means you're not just understanding the size of the opportunity for younger generations, but also the sheer operational magnitude of the risk.
It sounds like this silent avalanche is forcing every sector, banking, law, tech, to adapt right now.
They have to adapt immediately or face the consequences of just massive and I think largely avoidable capital dissipation. So to really appreciate the scale of this transfer, we first have to, map out where the wealth is right now, the generational distribution.
And it's a story of incredible concentration.
Unprecedented concentration. If we just look at the United States, baby boomers, so those born between 1946 and 1964, they hold the undisputed lion's share of the capital.
And when you put a number on it, it's pretty startling. The boomer generation holds just over 50% of the total U.S. net worth.
That's right. To be specific, it's about $78.1 trillion out of an estimated $156 trillion in total U.S. assets, according to recent figures.
Wow, and that's not even counting the generation before them.
Exactly. We have to include the silent generation. They account for another very significant $18.6 trillion. So this century of accumulation, really, that forms the bedrock of the avalanche.
But before we can talk about the final transferable amount, there's a pretty important adjustment we have to make, right?
A crucial one. We have to talk about non-transferable assets.
Right, because that $84 trillion figure, it isn't all liquid, and you can't just give it all to your kids. A lot of it is tied up in retirement vehicles.
Precisely. The research estimates that approximately $25 trillion in pension assets are typically non-transferable outside of a spousal continuation. So we're talking about annuity payments, defined benefit plans.
Things designed to support the person until they die, and then they just stop.
Exactly. So once we exclude those pensions and the non-transferable retirement funds, we get to the core number that we're really tracking here, and that's about $71 trillion in transferable wealth.
71 trillion, expected to flow mostly to Gen X and Millennials over the next 3 decades.
That's the active pile of capital on the move.
So let's talk about the speed, the velocity, because calling it a tsunami suggests this isn't some slow 50-year trickle.
And it's not. The velocity is what defines the crisis here. The process is accelerating very, very rapidly now that the majority of baby boomers are entering their later years.
So what's the near term look like?
The near-term indicator shows that $16 trillion of these assets are expected to move within the next decade alone.
16 trillion in just 10 years. That's almost a quarter of the total.
Think about that. That speed doesn't just put pressure on individual families trying to figure this out. It puts a massive stress on the entire financial infrastructure.
Absolutely. The whole system.
It shifts from a gradual trend to a sustained, high-volume environment very, very quickly. Projections are showing that by 2032, over $1 trillion is likely to move annually, every single year.
$1 trillion a year. That demands systemic adaptation across, well, everything. The legal sector for probate, the financial sector for allocation.
The banking sector for compliance and risk management. If the system isn't ready to process that annual volume, we risk just severe backlogs, unnecessary friction.
And that friction just diminishes the value of the inheritance itself.
Right. If the complexity of the assets causes delays, you're basically creating a traffic jam in the wealth transfer pipeline. And in this world, time equals lost capital, or at the very least, much higher administrative costs.
So the system itself becomes the bottleneck.
It could, slowing down the entire economy. And, within that massive $71 trillion, we have to pull out one more critical piece. It represents a major values shift.
The philanthropic side of it.
The philanthropic redirection, yes. The sources project that a significant $11.9 trillion of that total sum is projected to be channeled toward philanthropic endeavors.
Almost $12 trillion. Going to foundations, endowments, charities. That's a huge amount of capital being dedicated to community investment and social causes.
It is. It says a lot about legacy planning, about the intent of these older generations to build something that goes beyond their immediate family.
But it also places an enormous new responsibility on the nonprofit sector.
Oh, absolutely. To manage and deploy capital at a scale they have quite literally never encountered before.
Okay, so let's get into the type of wealth being transferred, because this is where the real management challenges start. What's the composition of these assets, how much is easy to manage, and how much is not?
And that's the core of the problem. The reports really highlight this illiquidity challenge. I mean, sure, some portion is held as liquid stocks and bonds, but a huge amount of the wealth is highly concentrated in these complex, illiquid holdings.
And that introduces risks that, say, inheriting a simple S&P 500 fund just doesn't have.
Not at all.
So let's start with the biggest illiquid component, real estate. The sources estimate this is a core multi-trillion-dollar part of boomer wealth. Everything from a primary home to huge commercial holdings.
This concentration in real estate, and it could be over $70 trillion when you consider all forms of property ownership across those two generations, it presents a profound operational burden for the heirs.
Can you break that down? What's the difference between inheriting stock and inheriting, say, an apartment building?
Well, if you inherit a diversified stock portfolio, the management burden is pretty low. You call a broker. But if you inherit, say, a portfolio of single-family rentals scattered across 5 states
or 1,000 apartment units, as you mentioned earlier.
Right. The heir needs immediate hands-on operational expertise. They have to understand tenant law, property maintenance cycles, local market dynamics. It's a full-time job.
A job most heirs are not trained for.
Exactly. And many of them are immediately forced to sell.
And if you're forced to sell, you have to do it carefully to preserve the value.
Which brings us to a key strategic tool your sources highlighted, the 1031 exchange. Why is this IRS provision so vital here?
The 1031 exchange, or a like-kind exchange, is vital because it lets the investor, or in this case the inheriting family, defer capital gains taxes when they sell one investment property and buy a like-kind one.
So it's about avoiding a massive tax bill, a staggering tax bill. Imagine an heir immediately sells an apartment complex that's appreciated like crazy over 40 years. They'd face a huge capital gains tax on all that appreciation, which would drastically shrink the inheritance.
So instead of selling, taking the tax hit, and walking away with less, the smart strategy is to use the 1031. You exchange that complex high-maintenance building they inherited
for a simpler, maybe more diversified or more liquid real estate investment, like a professionally managed property.
But there's a catch, isn't there? It's not that simple.
There's a very tight timeline, and this is where expert management is non-negotiable. The heir has to identify the replacement property within 45 days of selling the original one.
Only 45 days.
And they must close on that new property within 180 days. It's a sprint. If you fail to meet those deadlines, the deal is off, you realize the capital gain, and you owe the full tax bill. And on large transfers, that can be tens of millions of dollars.
So the clock starts ticking the second the property transfers. It demands pre-planning, specialized advisors. It's clear that to manage this asset class, you have to use these tax mechanisms perfectly, or the value just evaporates.
Wow.
That focus on illiquidity, it takes us right to the areas where this wealth is, well, literally disappearing.
It's just evaporating.
Right. These are the major failure points, caused by a lack of planning or just gaps in our systems. Let's start with what you've called the $10 trillion business succession crisis.
This is a massive, tangible risk to the real economy. About 14% of that $71 trillion in transferable wealth, so around $10 trillion, is tied up in small to medium-sized business valuations.
And these aren't just passive assets on a spreadsheet. These are functioning companies.
Absolutely. They're manufacturers, local retail chains, specialized service providers. They are the backbone of local employment and commerce.
And the risk of this wealth just dissipating is alarmingly high because the current owners, well, they haven't planned ahead.
The statistics are just shocking. The sources show that somewhere between 80% and 90% of business owners lack a formal exit strategy.
80 to 90%. They're running these crucial operations with no plan for what happens next.
And the result of that inaction is a catastrophic failure rate. Only about 1/3 of these small businesses actually achieve a profitable, successful transfer, whether that's to a family member, an internal team, or an outside buyer.
And that failure rate translates directly into lost capital and, I assume, lost jobs.
It does. The sources estimate an evaporation of up to $7 trillion in enterprise value if these transfers fail. And you're right, this is so much more than one family's loss. It's a systemic operational continuity crisis for the real economy.
So when a profitable job-creating business just shuts down because the heir couldn't manage it or there was no succession plan, the effects ripple out.
Immediately, through local employment, local tax bases, and entire supply chains. You could genuinely see a massive contraction in specific regional economies if, say, a whole sector of suppliers fails around the same time because of this.
It gives a new, urgent meaning to that old saying, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations.
It does. Except this time, it's the abrupt loss of functional enterprises, not just the slow squandering of wealth. If we apply this much urgency to managing liquid stocks, we need even more for these $10 trillion in businesses. Otherwise, we face a systemic capital loss that permanently shrinks our economy's productive base.
Okay, so if business succession is the failure point for the old economy, then the irretrievability of digital assets, that's the unique failure point for the new economy,
A crisis of irrecoverable wealth.
caused purely by technology.
And the structural risk is entirely unique to this specific wealth transfer. We're seeing explosive growth in digital assets, cryptocurrencies, NFTs, tokenized securities. The projections are just wild. Tokenized real-world assets alone are projected to hit $30 trillion by 2034.
So this is going to be a major part of inheritances going forward.
A non-trivial component, absolutely.
But the core problem, as you said, is irretrievability. Can you explain one more time why a Bitcoin wallet is so fundamentally different from a bank account when an heir tries to access it?
In traditional finance, everything is centralized. An executor might not know your exact account number, but they can go to the bank with a death certificate and a court order.
And the bank has the master record. They can grant access.
The blockchain doesn't work that way. Access is governed by a private key or a seed phrase. If that key is lost, or if no one knows where it is, there is no central party. There's no bank, no court, no one who can legally or technologically recreate it for you.
So the assets are still there, technically, on the blockchain, but they're functionally lost forever.
Functionally lost. And we already have hard data on this. Conservative estimates suggest a huge chunk of early digital wealth is already gone. Up to 20% of all Bitcoin and maybe 5% of Ethereum tokens might be permanently inaccessible because of lost keys or wallets.
We're talking about billions, maybe trillions of dollars just floating out of reach in the digital ether.
And this highlights the critical gap between our legal frameworks and the technology itself. We have legal attempts to fix this, like the Revised Uniform Fiduciary Access to Digital Assets Act, or RUFADA.
Which gives an executor the right to access the account.
But, and this is the key distinction the sources make, the law cannot override cryptographic reality. RUFADA gives you the legal right, but if the private key is missing, the technology still prevents access. The court order doesn't matter.
The legal framework is basically fragile because it can't magically recreate the password.
Exactly. Which means the planning strategy has to evolve far beyond traditional estate planning. This brings us to the technological solution that wealth managers have to embrace now: multi-signature or multi-sig wallets.
How do those work, and why are they a better countermeasure?
Multi-sig wallets are essential because they distribute control. They operate on what's called an N of M key structure. So, for example, a family might set up a 2 of 3 wallet.
Meaning you need 2 out of the 3 designated keys to move the assets.
Exactly. Maybe one key is held by the primary heir, one by the wealth manager, and one by an independent trust attorney.
So if the main heir loses their key, The other two can still work together to recover the funds. It's not a total loss.
Precisely. It prevents recovery from hinging on a single point of failure. And, crucially, it also prevents the catastrophic mistake of listing the private key directly in a public legal document like a will.
Which is a security nightmare, basically posting the password for millions of dollars for the whole world to see once the will is prorogated.
A complete disaster. Multi-sig technology is the necessary technological countermeasure here. Wealth managers have to become secure architects of code, not just interpreters of financial ledgers. All right, so we've got the scale, we've got the risks. Now let's talk about the earthquake. I mean, the economic earthquake this is going to cause.
Ripple effects.
Exactly, because when you move trillions of dollars into a new generation's hands, you are going to fundamentally reshape, well, everything. Consumer behavior, markets, the works.
And we can start with a concept most people have heard of, the wealth effect. Your net worth goes up, so you feel more comfortable spending. But this transfer adds a really critical and potentially inflationary twist.
The high marginal propensity to consume, or OEPC.
Right. Break that down for us.
This is where the real market stimulation comes from. Younger beneficiaries, so Gen X and Millennials, they generally have a much higher MPC than the older benefactors.
Why is that?
Well, because the younger cohorts often have higher debt loads, student loans, mortgages, or they just haven't hit their peak earning years yet. So if you inject a large, unexpected sum of capital into their hands, a greater portion of that money will be spent immediately, not saved.
So this massive redistribution of trillions into the hands of these high MPC spenders, on its face, that sounds like a recipe for broad economy-wide inflation.
It creates enormous inflationary pressure, yes. But the analysis suggests that the inflation might not be broad and uniform across all sectors. Instead, we're likely to see targeted demand inflation.
Targeted, meaning we need to look closer at what younger, newly wealthy consumers actually spend their money on.
Precisely. Compared to the older generation whose savings are being transferred, the analysis of how sudden wealth translates into spending, and you can often track this through the housing wealth effect, it indicates spending is focused away from staples and more towards specific discretionary categories.
Things that align with the preferences of younger demographics.
Right.
So give us some concrete examples from the sources.
The spending is heavily concentrated in leisure, experiences, and travel. For instance, the sources show a really notable correlation between this kind of capital injection and spending increases in, say, sporting goods and hobby stores. That correlates at about 0.8%.
That's a high correlation.
Very high. And airlines and travel services are also high, near 0.7%. So the story is the young heir isn't necessarily buying more groceries.
They're buying new hiking gear, upgrading their hobbies, taking more trips, maybe finally paying off that student debt.
It signals a real shift in consumer focus. And this creates a very nuanced policy challenge. A central bank trying to cool this kind of inflation might find their traditional broad tools are less effective because the pressure is so specific to these discretionary sectors.
Interesting. So what about the housing market? A sector that is already under immense stress globally.
This transfer hits housing with a kind of dual mechanism. It affects both supply and demand at the same time, which creates a really complex interplay.
Okay, let's start with the demand side.
The demand side is pretty straightforward. Increased wealth, often from a large gift or an inheritance, allows younger buyers who were previously locked out of the market to suddenly become homeowners. That boosts demand.
But the supply side is affected by what the heir does with the property they inherit.
Right. Not every heir sells the family home. Inherited real estate might be held as an investment, turned into a rental unit rather than being sold. And that decision to hold the property can actually increase the supply of available rental units in the market.
So you have more demand from newly financed buyers, but also potentially more supply from inheritors holding property as investments. What's the net result for house prices?
The sources suggest this dual effect may lead to minimal long-term price variation on average, but a substantial increase in transaction volume. The market just gets a lot busier.
But there's a huge societal cost here, isn't there? This transfer seems to just institutionalize inequality in homeownership.
Crucially, yes. Parental housing wealth is the primary way young adults get financial help. a down payment gift, a co-signed loan, and that dramatically increases their probability of becoming a homeowner.
Which hardens the barriers for everyone else. Homeownership becomes highly influenced by your family's assets.
It is a critical reinforcing mechanism that just compounds class divisions. And shifting gears to the entrepreneurial world, inherited wealth also plays a huge role in startup financing.
It provides the seed capital for self-financing, giving a young entrepreneur a lot more independence from, say, traditional venture capital.
That independence is a massive advantage. They can take bigger risks. But the sources are quick to caution that success isn't just about the money itself.
It's about what they call capital-associated resources.
Exactly. Just inheriting seed money is not enough. Entrepreneurs still need strategic support from investors who bring non-capital assets, commercialization skills, management experience, and access to established networks. Without that, the inherited capital can be deployed inefficiently and just disappear.
And finally, on the investment side, as younger generations take over family offices, how is that changing where the money flows?
We're seeing a really pronounced shift. Younger generations acting as major limited partners, or LPs, and funds are moving away from traditional private equity buyouts of mature firms and toward growth equity.
They're looking for active, high-growth deployment.
Right, into innovative assets, often in tech, often with companies that align with their values. It reflects a desire for both financial return and a more proactive engagement with their investments. And we have to pivot now, I think, from the purely financial metrics to the societal impact, because the sources are really clear on this.
You can't separate the two.
You can't. They're completely intertwined. And the first, and honestly the most sobering point, is how this transfer has the massive potential to just blow up the existing structural wealth gaps.
The sources use very direct language here, that due to structural and historical racism, this transfer has the massive potential to worsen the racial wealth gap in the U.S.
It's a compounding effect. It's essentially locking in the economic disadvantages of the past. The analysis suggests these disparities, which were driven by systemic discrimination blocking minority families from accessing things like the GI Bill, from generating housing equity.
They are likely to repeat and compound for generations to come. The transfer ensures that the stratification we have today becomes the stratification of tomorrow.
Exactly. And a policy prescription you often hear, just increase access to homeownership today, is explicitly called out in the research as being insufficient to fix this. The system is already too skewed.
That's a critical finding. It underscores that we need deep systemic interventions that target the roots of this divergence, not just the symptom of low homeownership. The issue is a lack of baseline capital to begin with.
It calls for policies that intentionally break that compounding cycle. And let's connect this to mobility. When you have 35% to 45% of all wealth being inherited, inheritances just take on a much greater importance compared to self-made fortunes.
And this concentration creates what the sources are calling the glass floor. Can you explain that concept?
The glass floor is essentially the safety net provided by inherited capital, combined with parental advantages like better schooling, paid for college, and powerful social networks. It acts as a structural barrier that prevents children from privileged families from falling below a certain economic level.
Regardless of their own career risks or choices, they have the option to fail without it being a catastrophe.
Exactly. And that is a profound constraint on upward mobility for everyone else. While the transfer might create some short-term economic stimulus, it also reinforces the idea that your starting line, your family's wealth, is the primary determinant of your financial finish line.
It creates a structural rigidity. But we also have to look at the personal, emotional side of this, the intangible burden of legacy.
Absolutely. For the recipients, the money provides immense optionality. It can change their career choices, their lifestyle.
But the sources say receiving unearned funds can also cause significant emotional unease.
Right. Recipients often struggle with a deep desire to establish their own identity, independent of the family money. This can necessitate a pause, sometimes for years, just for emotional processing before any big financial decisions are made. They have to reconcile the wealth with their own sense of earned success.
And it often surfaces pre-existing family strains. Complex emotional issues get tangled up in discussions about money and distribution.
Which means the challenge for advisors goes way beyond mere asset allocation. It becomes about transferring the intangible elements of stewardship. The research shows that what matters more to many Americans than the money itself is passing on family values, traditions, and wisdom.
So advisors have to instill the discipline and strategic thinking required to prevent that shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves syndrome.
Exactly. And that focus on values is perfectly reflected in the capital shifts we're seeing in the market, specifically the move toward ESG and impact investing.
And this is happening at a really critical intersection, isn't it?
Yeah.
The generational transfer of capital is meeting a significant gender transfer of wealth.
It is. Women are projected to control over 60% of U.S. wealth by 2025 due to longevity and other factors.
This is critical because both younger generations and women historically show a much greater interest in sustainable and diversity-based investing, or ESG, compared to the older generation of male benefactors.
And this demand isn't passive. It's an activist mandate. The sources note that about 90% of younger investors want their money to be used to actively influence companies' environmental and social decisions. They want portfolio managers to hold corporations accountable.
Which forces massive institutional change. If 90% of your future clients are demanding this, then ESG moves from being a niche product to a de facto fiduciary standard.
It does. It accelerates the institutional adoption of ESG metrics globally and forces huge portfolio diversification away from non-compliant assets. Heirs may be forced to sell off concentrated family stocks or businesses that were the source of the wealth, injecting new movement and volatility into the markets.
Okay, let's pivot to action then. We've laid out these monumental risks, illiquid assets, digital fortunes just vanishing, this growing inequality.
Yeah.
So what are the strategic imperatives? I mean, what can families actually do? And what should policymakers be thinking about? Let's start with private planning strategies.
The foundational element, without a doubt, is preparation. Deep intergenerational communication and stewardship. Advisors have to facilitate these difficult conversations to make sure heirs are financially and emotionally ready.
They need to understand the structure of the wealth and have a shared vision for its purpose.
Right. A lack of knowledge is often the greatest risk. And then, of course, there's maximizing tax efficiency. This is where specialized knowledge can save families millions, even billions.
And the most powerful provision here for preserving capital is the step-up in cost basis.
This is often called the multi-billion-dollar loophole. It's a critical provision that essentially erases accrued capital gains tax liability when the benefactor dies. The asset's cost basis is legally stepped up to its current market value.
So if your grandfather bought a stock for $10 and it's worth $110 when he passes away, your new cost basis is $110. If you sell it the next day, you owe zero capital gains tax.
Exactly. It's a massive transfer of value, free of income tax, legally speaking. And for the ultra-wealthy, there's also advanced planning using things like the generation skipping transfer GST tax exemption, which allows assets to pass directly to grandchildren to minimize taxes across multiple generations.
Securing dynastic wealth.
Yes.
Now, what about the unique threat of digital wealth? How do you plan for that?
You need robust, technologically informed planning. First, a detailed encrypted letter of instruction is non-negotiable. It's a plain English guide explaining what wallets and assets exist and outlining the multi-step access protocol.
Stored very securely, obviously.
Across multiple physical and digital locations. But as we discussed, the gold standard solution here is the multi-signature or multi-sig wallet.
This has to be the highest priority.
It is. We need advisors and lawyers who are capable of setting up these 2 of 3 or 3 of 5 key structures. This distributes control and eliminates that single point of failure. It provides the necessary institutional security for these decentralized assets.
Okay, so that's the private side. Now let's move to public policy, because the current U.S. tax code is just not equipped for this. The traditional estate tax has been, as one source put it, eviscerated.
It's paid by only 1 in every 1,300 estates. The exemptions are just too high. So reform is essential, and the debate is really centering on fundamentally restructuring how we tax inherited capital.
Policy option 1, the shift to an inheritance tax. How does that change things?
This proposal repeals the current estate and gift taxes and replaces them with a tax that targets the recipient, the heir. It's considered more politically resilient because it's framed as a silver spoon tax, targeting the wealth of the most fortunate heirs.
Instead of a death tax.
Exactly. And the estimate suggests this could raise a substantial amount of money, over $900 billion over a decade, with a reasonable lifetime exemption for each person.
It shifts the tax burden to the person receiving the unearned capital.
It aligns with the public's general feeling that receiving unearned wealth should carry a heavier tax burden than wealth you earn through your own labor.
Okay, policy option 2. This one is more novel. The Rignano tax. It sounds theoretical, but it's gaining traction because it directly targets dynastic wealth.
The Rignano tax is fascinating because it tackles that dynastic concentration head-on. The core idea is to tax old money wealth that's already been inherited more heavily than new money, which is wealth earned by an individual.
The philosophy being that each successive generation of inherited wealth should contribute more to society. But how do you actually track that? How do you know if money is old or new?
And that is the primary administrative challenge. It would require creating some kind of registry to track the origin and tenure of capital. Conceptually, the tax rate might increase with each generation that holds the asset. It explicitly tries to mitigate long-term inequality by discouraging perpetual family dynasties.
And finally, policy option 3, taxing unrealized gains at transfer. This one directly attacks that step-up in basis loophole we just talked about.
This measure would treat the transfer of appreciated assets at death as a deemed realization event. It would tax the accrued capital gains on assets above a certain threshold at the time of transfer.
It closes a loophole.
It closes the loophole, raises substantial revenue, and promotes greater economic efficiency by reducing the incentive for people to hold appreciated assets until death just for tax avoidance. It's projected to raise over $1 trillion over a decade.
These are huge structural debates. But technology is also pushing forward with solutions, isn't it? This borderless wealth demands new wealth tech.
Absolutely. DLT, smart contracts, AI, they're all being used to streamline transfers by automating parts of legacy planning. AI can track complex trust documents across different jurisdictions, improving visibility and speeding things up.
And for digital assets specifically, we need to move beyond just the legal frameworks.
We do. Policymakers and industry leaders need to focus on creating licensed, secure custody services for digital assets and on harmonizing global standards. Because digital wealth is inherently borderless, a patchwork of national laws just makes the risk of loss even worse. We need robust, tech-driven infrastructure to manage these unique risks on a global scale.
So when you step back from all this,
Mm-hmm.
this $84 trillion transfer, it's just this incredible inflection point in history.
Yeah.
And our deep dive today, I think it really shows the complexity is twofold, right?
Absolutely. It's about maximizing financial efficiency on one hand.
And mitigating the societal risk on the other.
On the efficiency side, that means securing those illiquid assets, protecting that estimated $7 trillion in business value and implementing advanced security like multi-sig wallets to stop digital fortunes from being lost forever in the ether.
And on the societal side, it means staring directly at the massive potential for this transfer to lock in and exacerbate existing racial and social wealth gaps, which demands proactive policy that goes way beyond just tinkering with an old estate tax system.
And the silent avalanche, it's forcing a paradigm change in the markets. The activist mandate from the younger generations means that ESG and sustainable wealth management, they're rapidly moving from a niche offering to a core fiduciary standard.
It's a values alignment shift as much as it is a capital shift.
It dictates where the next trillions will be invested.
Ultimately, the true legacy of this transfer isn't going to be the sheer numerical value of the capital. It's going to be the successful transfer of wisdom, purpose, and values alongside it, making sure that wealth serves a meaningful, productive function for generations to come rather than just dissipating.
And that leads us to a final provocative thought for you to consider, building on our discussion of things like the Wigiano tax and that glass floor. If the structural goal of inherited capital is primarily to create a protective economic floor preventing the privilege from falling, what policies, what equivalent systemic resources or changes are necessary to build an equally resilient safety net for those who receive no capital transfer? How do we ensure genuine intergenerational mobility for all households, regardless of their starting point? That is the ultimate challenge of this great transfer.